Hello, and welcome to Barn Blog. And I'm going to be doing a radical engagement on something I don't normally do, which is a blog post that is very, very current, which is by Michael Roberts on the Trump tariffs. Now, I don't always agree with Michael Roberts. He's kind of a perpetual tendency of the rate of profit decline person, which I, in broad spectrum, still agree with. And like production rates decline over time, and that leads to complicatedness in profits, although aggregate profits are probably the highest they've been, even if coming into this mess, even if they're being hurt now. I want to talk about, though, this in terms of the current Trump tariffs and what a Marxist or Marxian economist might say. And this was from April 4th. I'm going to release it this weekend, so this is going to be barely a week old, but some of this news may be out of date, even with me releasing it within the same week. So heads up on that. This is what Michael Roberts was thinking, after Liberation Day. So let's get right into it. Trump tariffs and facts and consequences from various sources. We start with a meme with Trump yelling at penguins, pay the tariffs. We'll be taking our business elsewhere, says the penguins. One, the overall impact of Trump's tariff hike is to raise the average tariff rate on U.S. goods to 26%, the highest level in 130 years. It's even higher than the Smoot-Hawley acts that brought on the Great Depression. You can see this here, effective U.S. tariff rate. The last time it was anything close to this high was in 1890 when we were building up our industrial capacity, which if you follow the buildup of industrial capacity, that's when these kind of protectionist measures often make sense. But even then, they need to be targeted. And then you can see there is a general decline until 1920, a steep increase, and then another steep increase in the 1930s. Then, believe it or not, part of the New Deal was to quietly lower tariffs up into and in during the war. Tariff rate went up a little bit in the 50s and then went down dramatically in the 60s and 70s, but you're still under 10%. And then you see this tariff rate is about 3%, probably historically low compared to other nations. And then it jumps up to 25%. Now, you might be going, Varn, there's only a 10% tariff on things. Well, that's the base tariff that's applied to everything. It's not the case here. So, two, the formula used to establish a tariff for each country exporting to the U.S. is not related to any unfair taxes, subsidies, or non-tariff barriers imposed by countries on U.S. exports. Instead, it follows a simple formula. Namely, the size of the U.S. trade deficit with each country divided by the size of U.S. imports from that country, then divided by 2. Now, many other liberal reporters and even some conservative ones have noticed this since then, that the math that the Trump administration has been giving is false, and that the math is actually simple. There's even some indications that the math is based off of a calculation that was from ChatGPT. It's hard to prove that, though. So let's go in here. An example, American runs a U.S. $23 billion deficit with Vietnam, which imports U.S. $137 billion. So it deemed to have a tariff barrier equal to 90% of the import tariff. The tariff formula applies to reciprocal trade on half of that, which is 45%, to reduce the bilateral deficit by half. Problem is, Vietnam does not have a 90% tariff on U.S. imports, so it cannot avoid a reduction in sales to the U.S. by agreeing to reduce its tariff on U.S. exports. And it's even tried to. Since Michael Roberts wrote this, the Vietnamese government came up and said they'd go with 0 tariffs, and Trump still said no. Which, of course, that plus the fake news that Trump was going to put a 90-day halt on the tariffs again as a negotiating strategy not going through led to a weird blip up and then blip deep down in the stock market within 3 hours of the morning. 3, the move will have significant impact across countries of the global south. Some of the highest tariffs are among the lower income developing countries in South and Southeast Asia, like Cambodia and Sri Lanka. And of course, these countries are trying to protect their internal economy, and they don't really sell that much to the United States in the first place. Trump's tariffs are not only on goods and imports, not services. The U.S. runs a deficit on goods with the European Union's countries, so Trump has imposed a 20% tariff on those imports. But there is no measure against services, about 20% of all the world's trade. The EU runs a surplus on goods with the US, but significant deficit in services, banking, insurance, professional services, software, digital communications, etc. with the US. If services had been included, the US deficit with the EU would virtually disappear. Trump is only thinking about real commodities, and even diehard old school Marxists like Michael Roberts doesn't think that that's good enough. Just pointing that out. Number 5, all countries, even those running a deficit with the US in traded goods, are subject to a 10% tariff. This also applies to countries without any trade to the US or any people. Diego Garcia, Antarctica. The tariff on the UK is 10%, for example. So although the UK goods trade is virtually in balance with the US, 58 billion to 56 billion, it will still take a hit from the loss of good exports to its largest trading partner, the US. If Trump's tariffs formula for goods were applied to the UK, there should be no tariffs on imports from the UK. In contrast, if trade services were included, the tariff on imports from the UK would be 20%. Morgan Stanley reckons the new tariff regime could knock up to 0.6% of the points of the UK growth, which is virtually zero anyway. The UK has been slowly declining for the last 5 years since Brexit. Been a lot of unforced economic errors worldwide, hasn't there been? Tariffs will substantially increase prices. Lewis consumers will bear the brunt of a wide variety of basic foods and essential goods that physically cannot be produced domestically, or even if they can, are dependent on things that cannot be produced domestically. See why your food's going to go up even when it's grown in America. With the poorest households being hit the hardest, and given that we're also cutting social services, that's going to be interesting. American industry will struggle with the higher cost for key intermediate supplies, machinery, and equipment, dwarfing any marginal benefits from reduced foreign competition. Another example, the 54% tariff on China could result in a drop of 507 billion in imports, and China only exports 510 billion in the first place. Trump's China tariff would reduce American imports by roughly 20%. This would cause a supply shock similar to the pandemic period, leading to a U.S. recession and or inflation. And I think we're now looking at both. That's what I think. That's not what Michael Rogers is saying here, although I'm sure he probably agrees with me. Retaliation by other countries will lead to a fall in U.S. exports. We've already seen this. China has been upping the retaliation almost every day, and we have been upping the retaliation back almost every day. In the 1930s, after the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were imposed, retaliation led to a 33% fall in U.S. exports and a spiraling down of international trade called the Hindenburg spiral. A cycle where tariffs reduced trade, then retaliation reduced it further, then more retaliation, then first-order effects on output, second-order effects on orders, then more tariffs and retaliation until global trade fell from $3 billion in January 1929 to $1 billion in March 1933. Now that's in, early 20th century money, and we're dealing with trillions of disappearing amounts of value today, but you know what I mean here. So we see the Hindenburg spiral here. A tariff trade war would hit the U.S. economy harder than Smoot-Hawley, since trade is now 3 times as big of a share of GDP as it was in 1929. And I've heard very few people mention that. I want to add that for myself. I've heard very few people mention that. And it was 15% of GDP in 2024 versus roughly 6% in 1929. So it's double the amount of the U.S. economy. The real GDP this year could be down 1.5 to 2% points, and inflation could rise close to 5% if the tariffs are not reversed. This is from the USB forecast, and falling trade growth will lead to falling international capital flows, weakening investment and global and economic growth globally, which is why you're seeing the world stock market, not just the Dow Jones or the S&P 500, fall. Now, a lot of people compare Trump to fascistoid and fascist and whatnot, and I've been hesitant to do so. Although this recent thing with just deporting people to slave labor prisons in El Salvador, including U.S. citizens, of which we know of at least 3 being deported there, where there is no release and there is less than 2 cubic feet of space per person in this prison, which is, is less than a coffin. I think depending on how the Supreme Court acts, it's not been super great on this. Amy Coney Barrett sided with the liberals on this, but so far as of today, and today as the 7th, it doesn't like the Supreme Court's going to act in anyone's favor. It looks like the promise of the war on terror to be brought home, which people like Alex Jones used to freak out about, has been brought home by his guy. And anyone on the fucking Marxist left talking about this being a good thing, nah. But I wanted to say, this is Yeltsin shit. This is into the Soviet Union shit. Biden was our Andropov, and now we're in our Gorbachev and Yeltsin period, except it's happening acceleratedly with less of anything to hold it together. And while today the fear of Trump might hold the Republicans in line and discipline, I don't know it'll last too long once things really get bad. But have they already given up too much power? Have the 100-year abnegation of Congress's right to legislate continue? I mean, they're even giving up the power of the purse at this point, which is insane. They've ignored the Impoundments Act and constitutional rulings on impoundments prior to the Impoundments Act. And I'm seeing, MAGA people try to justify this, but they won't be able to justify it forever when they start to starve. And it might not get that bad. We're a food abundant country, but we're also cutting our social services and infrastructure at the same time. Yeah. For those of you who thought the bourgeoisie were secretly in control, well, the bourgeoisie might just be really stupid. And we're finding out the hard way. Protect your peace, you're going to need it.